Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this British Academy and London Review Bookshop event. I'm Ritula Shah, and I'm delighted to be chairing tonight's conversation. It is, of course, a chance for us to celebrate the authors who've been shortlisted for the 2020 Nayef Al-Rodhan Prize for Global Cultural Understanding. The prize, which is worth £25,000, is the British Academy's way of recognising the enormous contributions to the public understanding of world cultures by non-fiction authors from across the world. Now, it was founded and generously sponsored by the neuroscientist and international relations scholar, Professor Nayef Al-Rodhan, and the first award was made back in 2013. The judging panel, chaired by Professor Patrick Wright, shortlisted 5 books this spring, and we're really thrilled tonight to welcome the authors here today ahead of the ceremony where the winner will be chosen. That announcement takes place on the 27th of October. I have no idea how they're going to choose. Forget the rule of 6. This is the rule of 5, and it's going to be a really tough choice. 5 fantastic books. So in our conversation over the next hour, we're going to explore the idea of cultural identity, why it matters, how we can move forward with it in what are clearly quite difficult times, problematic times. I'll let you choose the word you want to pick. And there will, of course, be time for questions later on. If you'd like to ask a question, just submit this in the YouTube chat section at the bottom of your screen. And you're welcome to tweet during the event. We'd love you to tweet, in fact. You can copy the Academy's Twitter handle, which is @British Academy, and also the London Review Bookshop's Twitter handle, which is @LRB Bookshop, and use the hashtag Al-Rodhan. So, without further ado, let's meet the writers. And honestly, these books are great. The writers are amazing. I'm so looking forward to this. Congratulations to all 5 of you for being nominated. It is a brilliant field. Really powerful books. Lots to reflect on. Let's begin with the first of tonight's authors. In no particular order, I've got nothing to do with the judging. Let's begin with Tanya Talaga. She's a journalist and the CEO of Makwa Creative. She's been nominated for All Our Relations, Indigenous Trauma in the Shadow of Colonialism. Tanya, this is a really compelling and at times quite harrowing book. It's an account of contemporary events. What's your connection to it?
Buzu anin Tanya Talaga Nagisnakas Kamusko Pimojije Pineshish Nagisnakas. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me here today, and I feel really honored to have my book All Our Relations placed amongst all of these wonderful books and incredible authors. Appreciate the question, Ritula. The book is, for me, it's actually quite a personal book. I think all of my writing is quite personal. I am an Anishinaabe Kwe woman. I'm a journalist, and I tell the stories of our people. This book very much is an extension of my first book, Seven Fallen Feathers. All Our Relation, though, takes it to sort of a different scale. I look at communities, Indigenous communities in colonized nations around the globe. I look at what has happened here in Canada, in America, in Brazil, in the Sami lands, in northern Norway and northern Sweden, Australia. These are the countries that I focus on, and I found that we all share, sadly, a common history of after contact, of our lands being taken away, of our people being violently separated from the land, of our children being taken away and put in something called Indian residential school system. Those schools were found in all of the nations that I've just spoken of, and they were meant to take the quote-unquote Indian out of the child, remove the part of us that is us, our language, our history, our culture, who we are, and make us, for lack of a better word, good British subjects here in Canada. So the book is actually, it started off as a look at why it is our children are taking their lives at record high numbers, how we have a suicide crisis in many of our First Nations communities. And the book actually became a look at why this is happening to me is a result of colonialism, is a result of ongoing genocide and inequities that our people still face here in Canada and in America and in Australia and in Brazil. and the Sami lands. So that's why I wrote the book.
Fantastic. Well, I hope we'll unpack some of those ideas a little bit during the course of this conversation. Let's meet our next author. Pekka Hamalainen is Professor of American History at Oxford University. Pekka, you've been nominated for Lakota America, A New History of Indigenous Power. A really gripping story with some extraordinary characters and dramatic encounters. What drew you in?
Well, exactly what you said. It is a very, very dramatic story. And filled with magnificent characters: the Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and so forth. But in a way, that was a problem for me. In a way that these are late 19th century leaders who contested with the expansion of United States. They were the Indian Wars, Lakota United States Wars, and then there's the Battle of the Little Big Horn in 1776, and which absorbs kind of the in a way the Lakotas have become kind of a props of that battle. They are the essential rivals for the United States Empire, and which diminishes their history in some ways. They are sort of kind of like just props for American history. So what I wanted to do in the book is actually to look how American history, writ large, over 4 centuries, how does it look like from Indigenous perspective? If we emphasize Indigenous agency, Indigenous ideas, Indigenous power, how does it look like? And it turned out Lakotas were actually kind of a perfect nation to do that, because they have they struggled with the colonial powers, starting with French, with the Spanish, then with the British, and then the Americans. They had the relationships and wars and diplomacy with all imperial powers in North America. So I was able to tell a very sort of full story in a way, over 4 centuries from Indigenous perspective. So that was kind of the genesis of the book.
And it does take in a fantastic sweep of history, as does our next book. Priyamvada Gopal is professor at the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge, and she's been nominated for Insurgent Empire, Anticolonial Resistance and British Dissent. It's a re-examination, I'd say, Priya, of everything that's often assumed about empire, a vast and undoubtedly prickly subject. What drew you in?
Thank you, Ritula. Thank you to the British Academy for shortlisting Insurgent Empire. I'm also very honored to be in this amazing company. So thank you. Well, I had, by about 2010, I had been involved quite a lot in debates on empire in Britain, including on the BBC. And I was starting to find that although there was a lot of disagreement and a lot of division, the debates themselves were quite sterile. They just ended up being position-taking and nothing really changing in terms of what information people had, what kind of understanding they might develop about contemporary Britain through the story of empire. So I wanted to write, in a sense, a counter history of empire to the one that is familiar to us in the British public sphere, where you really have a kind of, well, there were some, very terrible things, but on the whole, empire was, did some very good things, from the railways to the English language. And at the end of the day, Britain bestowed freedom on her colonies. And I wanted to challenge that mythology, but I wanted to challenge it through a kind of different kind of lens. And the lens that I alighted on is something I've been interested in all my life, which is the idea of dissent and opposition and resistance. My early work was on resistance in India as the new nation was coming into being in 1947. So this book actually does two things. One is that it looks at dissent against the British Empire in Britain. We're often told to believe that, back in the day, people didn't have a problem with the empire, but as with slavery, people had a problem with empire. And of course, there was a great deal of resistance in the colonies. And the book really is saying what kind of common ground were people able to forge in Britain and in the colonies through the lens of dissent, through the practice of dissent. And I began with a hunch, and the book is really the unraveling of that hunch, which is to say there was a relationship between anti-colonial resistance in the colonies and criticism of the British Empire in Britain, that what we had was people forging common ground and shared understanding through becoming allies in the project of resisting the empire. That's the kind of broad outline of the book.
And again, I hope we'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's hear from our next author. Hazel V. Carby is the Charles C. and Dorothy S. Dilley Professor Emeritus of African American Studies and Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Yale University. She's been nominated for Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands. Hazel, anyone who reads your book will know why you were drawn to the story, but I'm going to let you explain.
Thank you, Ritula, and thank you to the British Academy, and I'm delighted to be here among you all. So perhaps one way I could actually respond to your question is through some questions that I asked right at the beginning of the book, and they were questions that I would hope the book was going to respond to. So I ask if it's possible to produce a reckoning of movement between and among places, spaces and peoples, the sort of scattering that results in racialized encounters and the very violent transactions that produce racialized subjects. And so what I do is to pit the question of memory and history and poetics against each other in a narrative of racial encounters. And my intention is to actually undermine the binary thinking that we've become used to, that actually opposes colonial center to colonized margin, that opposes home to abroad and metropole to periphery. And so I ask, does it matter where encounters between Africans and Europeans, between those constructed as Black and as white, where those encounters take place? Does it matter if it's in an African or English village, town or city? If they occur in the impenetrable darkness of the dungeon of a coastal fort, or in the claustrophobic hold of a slave ship, or if they take place face to face in the glaring light reflected from the Atlantic Ocean, if they are confrontations on the shores of a Caribbean island, or on the streets of a metropolitan imperial city. One of the questions I ask is that perhaps it's not only the place that is significant, but also we need to take account of the manner of the journey and arrival, the eager walking, the manacled stumble, the panicked flight, or the forced or the voluntary sailing toward and away from each other. So the architecture of my tale, I always think, has the tensile strength of a spider's web that actually spans across the Atlantic. And spinnerets draw threads from archives, from histories, and from memories. And I join the movement of men from Britain during the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars to the flood of volunteers that left the Caribbean to travel to Britain during the Second World War. The radial fibers, I always feel, hold rural England and rural Jamaica in tension across the Atlantic Sea, but also, as well as the ocean, the port cities are very key here. The port cities, particularly of Bristol and Kingston. And there were many orphan threads that I had to leave broken because I couldn't find out how they actually all connected. I wasn't able to make repairs. But I feel that the web weathers and holds because it's a story of imperial intimacies, but also of geographies of pain, of the continuing aftermath of enslavement. And it's a story of land, of sea, as well as of war.
Hazel, thank you very much. Well, let's meet our fifth author. Charles King is Professor of International Affairs and Government at Georgetown University. He's been nominated for the Reinvention of Humanity, a story of race, sex, gender, and the discovery of culture. Charles, how did you come to untangle so many different stories of people who actually helped to knit together what we today understand as anthropology?
Yeah, well, the book is really the story of a remarkable set of individuals who pioneered what we might call the science of human unity. You know, I around 2014 or 15, I sensed, I think as many people did, but you know, we're at something of an inflection point in the way that we think about human difference. My wife and I happen to be standing outside the Supreme Court here in Washington when marriage equality became the law of the land in this country. You know, we had just reelected the first African-American president of the United States. And in country after country around the world, it seemed that we were shifting our basic categories of what we thought ordinary, normal, commonsensical ways of living looked like. And so what I thought I was going to do was write this triumphalist story of how we all became so broad-minded and capacious. And then, of course, 2016 happened in this country and its equivalent in other countries. And I realized that really the story I wanted to tell was one of continual struggle between two very different ways of seeing the world. On the one hand, a version of the world that placed all of humanity in a neat set of boxes, whether those are racial or gender or sexual or civilizational, cultural, and that then ranked those or set them up in some kind of hierarchy. And on the other hand, a much more capacious view of humanity that sees all of us as living in a particular place, in a particular time, and with a set of values and lenses that are unique to that time and place.
Well, it is a lot. Well, one of the things actually about all of these books, I have to say, is there are great characters in all of them. They're fantastically powerful people. And that's certainly true of Charles's book. So let's talk about some of those boxes that Charles mentioned there. Let's open them up. I want to talk about cultural identity and the fight for cultural identity, sometimes quite literally the violence that actually features in all of your books in other ways, and peaceful protest too. Tanya Talaga, your book deals very directly with the long tail of violence, how it plays out in Indigenous communities. Do you think that experience of violence becomes embedded in people's cultural identity?
Sorry, I just lost you for about half of your
I was just talking about the long tail of violence and to the extent to which, from the people that you spoke to in your book, the way in which that can become embedded in people's identity. How much do you think is that an issue? Is that a legacy?
Well, it's a forced legacy. It's a legacy that we did not ask for, but it's a legacy that we have. I mean, we met the colonizers and the settlers when they came here with treaty for the most part, you know, and treaties were meant to be nation to nation agreements. They were supposed to be seen as agreements that we made, our people made with the crown in order to share the land. The treaties were never meant to be surrenders of land. They were meant to be something else. We would share in the bounty of land and we would all live here together. And you have to understand, too, that these treaties were made by our people here who did not speak English, who did not have any background in English common law or the British parliamentary system whatsoever. And oftentimes, too, we were getting advice through translators and through members of the church. You know, violence is something that this continent of North America, we call it Turtle Island, was founded on. Martin Luther King also spoke of how this nation was, this entire nation, continent of North America, was founded on first the violence of the extermination of our people from our lands, and then after that, the violence of slavery. And we can see extensions of those, and the fact that the treaties that were all signed were, for the most part, almost 100% completely ignored or absolutely one-sided. Our people didn't ask to be put on reservations or in small communities sort of far-flung from other areas. We didn't ask to be put into residential schools or our children to be still taken away and put into the child welfare system. And this is violence that we still see today. So violence is part of our lives, and it is still something that we are grappling with here. You just have to look at what happened with the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May. And I could also point to the fact that since January 1st in Canada, 8 Indigenous people have died in altercations with police. 8. Violence is part of our lives, and it's still something that we are working desperately to overcome.
Pekka, I'm going to bring you in, because for the Lakotas, clearly being able to fight, being these extraordinary warriors, was a source of strength. But what would you say then has been the legacy? How would you compare with what Tanya's been saying?
Well, there's obviously a lot of similarities there, and in Lakota case, because they were quite powerful nation and eventually a powerful empire, they actually sought treaties with the United States, because in most cases, I think from the 1850s on, they were the more powerful nation, and so they got, they were able to negotiate very generous treaties in many ways, and extend their sovereignty over much of the sort of northwestern corner of the interior. So but then after the Battle of the Little Bighorn and after the battle of the massacre of Wounded Knee, the Lakota started to lose, and so it's a kind of very dramatic shift, which reflects the shift in relative power. The Lakotas become start to lose, and the treaties are renegotiated or ignored, and they lose much of their land base. So it's a kind of very, very dramatic, very abrupt kind of a collapse of everything, what was important to them, kind of disappearing, especially, with the land, their culture, their religion, everything was under attack. So, and like I said, it's the how fast it happened. It's it's just in a sense, in a blink of an eye. You go from being a very safe domineering power in some ways, and then everything is swept away. So, and the trauma continues obviously to this day.
Priya, you write about anti-imperial uprisings and the extent to which they cause outrage, provoke opposition at the time when they're unfolding. But then in the final analysis of why empire ultimately fails, do you think, or falls away, do you think they aren't necessarily given the credit, if you like, by historians for chipping away at the edifice?
By they, you mean people who resisted the empire?
Yes, people who resisted with violence sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, empire was resisted in a great many ways. Some of it was what we might describe, perhaps retrospectively, as peaceful boycotts, campaigns, rallies, signature campaigns, strikes. Strikes were a very big part of the resistance to the empire. And then there were things that, got called riots, but were actually uprisings of people who, ended up having no other option. There was also guerrilla warfare, as we know, in the case of Mau Mau. And my main argument is this, that the empire was chipped away at from the very beginning. I mean, one thing historians know about the empire is that it never went unresisted from day one, from the era of slavery to the post-war era in the 20th century. Empire was fiercely resisted. But the way in which we are now given the story is that Britain gave, and gave is the word, her colonies freedom when she determined that they were ready for it, when they were grown up enough to be free. And that is absolutely not the case. What we have is a retrospective appropriation of successful anti-colonial struggles as a British establishment decision. So we actually have an appropriation of the struggles of the colonized, and it now being presented as in much the way sometimes abolition is presented as something that was done by elite white men with a conscience. In fact, we know that slaves rebelled in the ways that they could rebel. We know that slavery and empire required immense amounts of violence to keep them in place. They required immense amounts of suppression, and people fought back even in the face of that kind of suppression. So yeah, part of my aim was to say, like Frederick Douglass famously said about slaves, let's remember that freedom is never given, that it is taken, and let us put back the struggles against colonialism and slavery, for that matter, to the center where they belong.
Hazel, I want to pick up the violence of slavery with you. It seems to me there were some enormously personal moments in your book. It seems to me the echoes of that violence were felt generations on. I mean, did that to you seem like the legacy of violence, some of the experiences of your father, indeed some of your own experiences?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think violence exists in many ways on many different levels. The book opens with the figure of the child who is actually being denied a cultural identity, always being asked, where are you from? And when she would tell people her address or that she was born in England, people would get extremely upset and say, no, you know what we mean before that. So the impossibility of being sort of Black and British, it took the child a long time to understand that she was being asked somehow to deny exactly what she was. Different levels of violence in terms of the racism I experienced every day in metropolitan London, particularly to my parents as a mixed race couple. My mother was sort of imagined to be nothing more than a prostitute if she could possibly have married a Black man. They couldn't find anywhere to live together, until they could actually, afford the deposit on a house. And so the violence of sort of structural racism works at many levels, at an everyday level, but also at a much wider historical level. So the book, by posing the question, where are you from at the very beginning, shows that actually there's an arc of 300 years that need to be traveled to understand the roots of that violence in the structural inequalities that we live in the aftermath of, that go back to enslavement. And not only that, but the refusal to actually really grant freedom to the enslaved. They may have been emancipated, but actually the labor regime under which they lived and the punishment and forms of discipline in Jamaica were extraordinary. So I think the question of violence works in very intimate ways, as well as at historical level between and among the metropole, the imperial power, and the colony. And so I try to reveal those different levels in traveling that arc of 300 years.
It is really fascinating to see the overlaps and the kind of the resonances between your five very different books. Charles, I'm going to move on slightly to talk about the foundational figure in your book, Franz Boas. a man who saw himself as a cultural anthropologist. He invented the idea in a way, and he also invented the idea of cultural relativism. And Margaret Mead, one of his protégés, refused, you say, I think, to acknowledge the idea that there was the superiority of Western culture. That tussle, that game of, if you like, I'm going to call it cultural top trumps, it continues really until this day. But why do you think, for someone like Margaret Mead, did cultural identity matter? Why did she come upon this idea and latch onto it?
Well, I think she was probably less concerned with the concept of identity, which is a very contemporary word for us now, and we're rightly concerned about it, about in the ways, as Hazel and others were mentioning, the ways in which the categories, the system, the violence given to you by a particular social or political context has deep, deep meaning for every aspect of your own personal life. But I think in their day, in Boaz's day, Mead's day, in the 1920s, 30s, they were perhaps more concerned about the concept of a category. Where do the categories that we think of as commonsensical, obvious, the ones that we approach our analysis of the world with, where do these come from? And what they discovered in going around the world, from American Samoa to Papua New Guinea to the Pacific Northwest, and studying societies very different from their own, was that every society of which we have knowledge creates categories. It's how we analyze the world, make our way in the world. What is different about overseas European colonialism and its successor societies is to build on top of those categories an allegedly universal science. So that, in every museum you went into, in London, Washington, New York, Paris, a century ago, you were told a story of human progress from so-called primitive to civilized peoples, and it was linear. And in looking back at pre-modern or so-called primitive societies, people from the developed West believed that they were looking back on their own history, looking back on the history of humanity. American tourists, when they go to London, say things like, I love being here because the place just has so much history. But this group illustrated that every society in the world has precisely the same amount of history. You just have to train yourself to recognize it. And if you can't see it, you're a prisoner of the categories that you yourself have created, your society's created.
I was shocked when I was reading your book. It was lots of things I thought I knew, but actually reading them written down sort of was a wake-up call. The way in which racism was kind of codified, was written into law, was something that was really striking, and something that I think it's easier to ignore, would you say, in the sort of debates we have today?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, the debates about racism or racist systems in the United States or elsewhere, from our perspective, it was easier to see when you had an explicit, for example, anti-miscegenation law that prevented marriage across racial categories. I was born in the year that it became fully legal in the United States for people across an African American and a white category to legally marry. The year I was born. So this is not ancient history in my own country by any means. But to the people living in that era, it was often, especially those in positions of power, it was not obvious that their systems were racist. It looked to so many people in positions of power where these systems justified their place at the top of a hierarchy. This looked completely natural. They were basing their understanding of legality on a pre-existing story that their museums and their anthropology classes and their history classes told them. And so when people today say, well, I would recognize those systems as immoral and racist, and we've solved all of those things, immoral racist systems don't exist today, they're being deeply ahistorical. You have to train yourself to see the injustice and the ridiculousness in a system of which you're a part.
And Tanya, picking up from that idea, those labels may officially have gone, but do you think, however unwanted they are, they stick? Those codes haven't left us subconsciously. They exist in our minds.
100%. They still exist. I mean, I'm just sitting here listening to Charles thinking about the myth of the noble savage, which is something that's perpetuated through North American storytelling, through movies, through books, through comic books, through cartoons, that we were just hanging around here in loincloths waiting to be saved, when nothing could be further from the truth. We had here in North America, for example, we had intense systems of governance. My people are part of the Council of the Three Fires, which predates contact, and which also thought of democracy before the word was uttered anywhere else. There's just this preconceived notions of the dominant power too, right? I mean, and when the British came here, they were the dominant power because they had flags. They put their flags down on the land, and they thought, well, there's no one appears to own this land, and we own land where we are. We have these big ships. We have this big system of, buildings and laws. So we must be more evolved than you. When actually, I would argue nothing could be further from the truth. It's a little bit different. And so we are still here. There were people here, and these notions and these labels still hang around. They're still taught in our schools. We're still, this might be a little bit too much for people in London right now, but the NBA, we just had our championship, basketball playoffs, and a lot of the players wore, instead of their names on their backs, they had sayings like Black Lives Matter or education reform. Education reform is something that picks up on what Charles is saying. We need to change how our children are taught, because they're still being taught with these preconceived notions and with books and history classes that do not tell the true history told by our people. Instead, they are, we're still in so many cases being talked about in little tiny paragraphs about what the fur trade was, for example, in Canada, or who Indians were. We have to change how our entire curriculums from start to finish in order to get rid of those labels. And that's going to be generational change.
Priya, we talk in the UK endlessly about class. I was fascinated by how you reveal a whole new perspective, in a sense, on the idea of the white working class, and you shape a narrative of labour solidarity across racial divides. Were you surprised by the depth of those connections? It's not something that's much discussed.
I was intrigued, for sure, and in some ways very glad to find evidence of working class solidarity with the colonized in Britain. There were groupings, there were rallies, there were demonstrations. I talked, for instance, about the Merit campaign, where there was a campaign in Britain to free 31 people who had been jailed in India for sedition, which is for rising against the King Emperor, but in fact for doing labor organizing. And there was a fairly successful and huge campaign in Britain to get working class Britons and ordinary Britons to say, not in my name, when it came to the kinds of violence and suppression that the empire was inflicting in the Caribbean, in India, in Africa. And that's just one example, the Merit conspiracy case. So I don't think I was surprised, but I was actually delighted to see that there is a very long history of trying to forge common cause between labor in Britain and labor in the colonies. And one of the things that we see running throughout the 100-year period that I look at is campaigners in Britain reminding their British audiences that the same people who might be having them work in very poor conditions in the mines and factories, who are keeping their pay low, who are keeping the working classes in some senses disenfranchised, are the same people who are running the colonial project. And rather than throw their weight behind the colonial project on racial grounds, it made more sense to forge alliances on, for instance, on the basis of class. And I think you're quite right that the category of the white working class is exploded in some of the stories that I look at, because what we have is a multiracial working class and attempts to forge solidarity on that basis rather than divide the working class as white and non-white.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience in a moment, but Hazel, I just want to ask you about that, because class and identifying your class tribe, as it were, isn't really a very comfortable place in your book. I wonder how you feel about it.
No, I mean, I think Priya is absolutely right in terms of what needs to happen to be able to forge solidarity across these lines. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to be able to understand and demystify how people actually think they have cultural identities, and how they have these various affiliations or senses of belongings. I mean, how is it that extremely poor people could also imagine that somehow, because they were white, they were actually superior to those who lived in the colonies? How do people learn this? And how can we unlearn this? How can we expose the fact that these cultural identities are taught? Maybe that we're taught that we are inferior as opposed to, superior. And I think it means asking some very, very difficult questions. And one of the sort of demystifications has to be around the question of white supremacy. Recent events have, if you like, put a lot of us people of color under the lens. But I think that one of the things we need to dismantle is that sense of the norm, the norm being whiteness. And so sometimes people are very, very reluctant to actually go to that stage, to actually dismantle how whiteness comes about, how white supremacy is not just adopted, but just assumed to be the norm. Because what that means is that, when we are organizing, one of the labels that's thrown at us, people of color, Indigenous people, is, you're just practicing identity politics. And of course, what this notion of identity does is to actually completely disguise that these are actually struggles to achieve social and racialized justice, to achieve equality. It's not actually really about identity at all. These are not internal questions. These are structural questions of structural racism and inequality.
Fascinating. There's another big conversation to be had there. Right, I'm going to get to questions from the audience, because we said there'd be time, and there absolutely is. And I'm going to come to you first, Pekka, because we haven't heard from you for a bit. The first question is a nice broad one in a way, which is, I'd like to know, the questioner says, to what the authors hope people will take away from reading their research. Mm-hmm. Pekka, what would be the one thing that you hope people take away from your book?
I think it's a history of cultural understanding. In the end, the book is about a struggle for cross-cultural understanding. There's a massive sort of a mental crevice between Native Americans and the European colonists. And I think, that's the history of North America in a nutshell, in a way that there's the people just thought differently. They thought differently about politics, diplomacy, war, belonging, all those things which bind societies together. They thought differently about it. As an example, the Europeans usually, saw Native Americans as primitives, partly because their societies were not hierarchical; they were flat. Their leaders were poor, not powerful, and that was because the basic structure for or basic idea for social structure was kinship. That's how Native Americans thought. If you are generous, with your things, you can become kin, you can belong, we can have an alliance. And the leaders were operated differently. The leaders would give all the possessions away. And in that sense, and in that way, they would forge kinship relationships and would actually become more powerful. It wasn't about stuff, it was about people and allies that mattered most. And this was really, really, really difficult for the Europeans to understand. And it's actually, I would say, they never got it in a way. It took 400 years, and it really they really never got it. There's an exception, though, the French, because they were weaker. They didn't have that kind of military power, so they actually accommodated with native peoples. And those alliances between Lakotas included, where they lasted for generations because there was mutual kind of weakness and all mutual, they were equally powerful. So there's an exception in the French case, which it kind of shows that, it didn't need to be that way. It didn't need to be that violent, that history. And there were other ways to coexist and frankly share the continent.
Charles, if there was one thing you would want people to take away from your book, what would it be?
Well, I think in a sentence, it's practice questioning your common sense. Because, the people who built deeply unjust, deeply violent systems around the world, from the Jim Crow system in my own country to various forms of overseas colonialism, they were doing it in ways that, from positions of power, they thought were utterly natural. Their theory about human society told them that this was the natural way to organize politics, or their theology told them this was the natural way to organize an economy or a social system. We have always to be careful about our sense of the obvious, our sense of common sense, because it too is a product of a time and a place and a cultural context, and it can really steer us wrong. We ought to be especially skeptical about any theory of the world, whether it's cultural or biological or philosophical, theological, that just happens to place a person like us, whatever that us is, at the top of some hierarchy. So I think that's the lesson from this group of anthropologists, is be very, very skeptical about any allegedly scientific theory that puts you on top. I'm
going to chuck a quick supplementary at you, which is directed specifically at you, which is there a particular group or groups that you hope the book is able to reach and influence?
Well, I hope it attracts a wide range of readers, but I will tell you the most moving thing that happened from a set of readers was when I got a whole group of letters from a group of undergraduates at a state school in California, all of them Latino women, who said for the first time, having had their first intro anthropology class and having been given this book to read, it was the first time they encountered a set of thinkers who came from backgrounds like theirs. And they came into the class expecting only to read the work of white men, and found a set of people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and Zora Neale Hurston and Ella Deloria, a Dakota Sioux activist and thinker. And that was really meaningful to me. We need a science that is as capacious as our theories of human society. And hopefully that is now happening.
Fantastic. Tanya, if there's one thing that people would take away from your book, what do you hope it is?
My book isn't a book of sadness. It isn't, while I deal with a lot of very difficult subjects, genocide and the deaths of our children here in First Nations communities, and also all colonized nations, Indigenous communities, this is really a book about resiliency, and it's a book about resistance, and it's a book about hope, and about how we can instill belonging and love in our people and pride, and show them that we can be proud of ourselves and that we have the knowledge given to us from thousands and thousands of years of how to keep moving forward and we know what we need to do to get there, and this is really a call to arms, so to speak. It's a book about hope and resiliency. And so I hope people read the book, especially in the UK, and get a broader sense of what colonization did to this country and to others.
Thank you. And Hazel, what would you like people to take away from your book?
Yes, like Tanya, I really do think that a complex understanding of the consequences of colonization is really key. But also, when I was listening to Charles, I was imagining what a sort of decolonized curriculum might look like if all our books were sort of required reading for students. But, I think he made a very important point about the sort of common sense understandings of cultural identity and to be very suspicious of those. And I'm hoping, that what people would take away from my book is an understanding of how we need to peel away those layers of common sense understanding, sort of to show how we have adopted and lived what are really racial fictions. And we need to understand them as fictions. Because of all moments in time, this is a moment when we need to come together, to be in total solidarity. We can't exist in these, ethnic or racialized silos anymore. We're facing the greatest catastrophe that humanity has ever had to face, which is climate catastrophe. And if we don't act in solidarity, then we have no hope, for a future. And so we can't afford to be divided anymore. We can't exist in these silos, these racial fictions which divide us. And, Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of this battle. They're at the forefront of opposing a petroculture and the distribution of fossil fuels. The Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of showing the rest of the planet how to actually live sustainably. We have to absolutely be in alliance now to preserve a future for all of us.
Another great discussion to be had there. Priya, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to let you answer that question in a moment, but there's another one specifically for you, which is, how does identifying resistance within Britain help us to navigate our way through Indian colonial history today in 2020?
Right. I will come to that if I may. Let me answer the first question and then this, because I think it'll make more sense. As Hazel says, we are in times when thinking about how to make alliances, how to talk across manufactured racial and other divides is absolutely essential for survival. So I would hope that one thing that particularly young people, and I would say I wrote this book for young people today in many ways, my students, for instance, I hope what they can take away from it is the importance of resistance and dissent when you're told certain things are this way and that is how they have to be. I think it is very important to ask whether they have to be that way and to push back and to ask critical questions. Always be not at ease where you live. Don't become too comfortable. Ask questions about your own culture. And I think that the related point I wanted young people, particularly in Britain, to understand is that criticism of empire is not anachronistic. It is simply not true that when Cecil Rhodes' statue was erected, everybody was okay with Rhodes. That is simply untrue. And I hope I've mapped for young people in Britain the fact that they don't have to take the official history of empire. There is a history of opposition and dissent within Britain that they can affiliate to, and that history is a history which tells them how to make common cause. It's not an easy thing, it's difficult, but it can be done. Now I'll come to the other question. I think, and I may be wrong, that the questioner means how does the history of what I've written about help us to think about how India today is behaving in ways that the colonizer once behaved? And I think that's a very good question. And what I would say is that Indians also need to look back at the legacies of anti-colonialism and look at the ways in which the Indian state, for instance, has fundamentally failed to decolonize and has in many ways become a colonizer in its own right, including of indigenous peoples within its borders. So whether it's young British people or whether it's young Indian people, I would say learn from dissent and learn to dissent and learn to form alliances, because we are all now in the same quagmire and only opposition and solidarity can get us out of it.
Gosh, there are so many interesting conversations that you're beginning, and I'm sorry we can't continue them. We have 5 minutes left, so you've all got less than a minute each. Basically, I'm going to begin with you, Pekka, to say one last question, which is, what's the most surprising thing you learned during the course of your research?
I think, well, that's a good question. The most surprising thing was how central Lakota people were, over several centuries in shaping American history. I mean, it's just that, they, like I said, they had interactions with multiple empires. They had many alliances with other indigenous peoples, and there were multiple wars, obviously. There's a creative diplomacy, and they were operating almost on continental scale. So I just all that was surprising to me, which is the scale and the creativity, the innovation, the capacity to think differently, adapt to different mindsets. All those things are essential for that history. It wouldn't have happened.
I'm gonna interrupt. I'm sorry to be so rude, but we are running out of time. Tanya, what's the most surprising thing you learned?
Well, when I started this book, I was looking at why it is our children take their lives at their own hands in such stark numbers here in First Nations communities in Canada. And then I saw the same pattern when I looked deeper into the actual reasons why in America, in Indigenous communities in Brazil, and in the Sami lands and in Australia, we share a commonality, a very sad one, of our children dying at their own hands. And a lot of the times it's young males that are taking their lives. And what binds us together are those things I talked about earlier: residential school, racist laws like the Indian Act, something that's still in our books here in Canada, stolen children in Australia. We have children that are also being taken away still by child welfare in North America. All of these things, these similarities, and when you just see they're just sitting right there, there's more that binds us together as Indigenous people globally than brings us apart.
And I think it's so contemporary what you're writing about. I think that's very, very striking. Hazel, what was the most surprising thing for you?
Well, it was extremely shocking to actually find the slave register in the National Archives that listed all the Carbys on the plantation in Jamaica. I wasn't surprised then about following through the descendants up to my father. But when I actually started to track the slave owner and find out who he was, I was really extraordinarily surprised. He was a soldier, an ordinary soldier who joined the British Army, but he came from this tiny village in Lincolnshire, the village of Carby in Lincolnshire. And what completely shocked me was that was the same village that my father was based in when he was in the RAF at Waddington, which is actually just next to the village. And he used to tell me, I mean, I don't know, children, sometimes get very bored with their father's war stories. But he used to tell me how flying back across the channel, he used to use the lights on a church tower to guide them back to the Air Force Base, as he said. Then when we saw those lights, we knew we were home. And that is the church that the slaveholder, Lily Carby, was baptized in as a child in the 1760s. That shocked me.
That is extraordinary. Right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to give 30 seconds each, first to Priya and then to Charles. But Priya, what surprised you about your research?
I was aware that there was criticism of the empire in Britain, but I surprised myself in a sense at how much and how long a period it was developed over. But the thing that I really discovered, and that was a surprise, was how much influence there was in Britain of resistance in the colonies. And it's a process that I describe in the book as reverse tutelage. We often talk about how Britain has influenced the world, but in the book, I discover and write about how resistance in the world actually influenced Britain.
Charles, last 30 seconds.
Well, as part of my research, I held in my hands Adolf Hitler's copy at the Library of Congress of an American bestseller from 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, which was a racist history of Europe, written at the time. Hitler called it My Bible, and is now in special collections here in Washington. And I think in doing the research, I was just blown away by the degree to which the Nazis were actively studying the most perfect system of racial segregation that existed in the world at the time, which was, of course, the United States. But when you're holding a thing from Hitler's library, there is nothing that brings that point home more than that.
Fascinating. Well, Charles King, Priya Gopal, Hazel Carby, Pekka Hamalainen and Tanya Talaga, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you for a great conversation. If you want to know more about the books and more about the prize, do look at the British Academy's website. And this is the moment when I'd normally kind of be hoping to find a table laden with books that you can go and purchase the books from. But in this virtual world we now inhabit, I think you need to go to the London Review Bookshop website and you'll find them there. Please do go and take a look. There's a feast of fantastic stories and people waiting for you. That's it. Thank you very much. Good luck to all of you, and I look forward to the announcement at the end of October.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.